The war is over. I'm still getting used to saying that, but that is where we are. However, just because the fighting may have stopped, that doesn't mean the work has. Japan lies defeated and is pretty broken. The Allies must now drag her back to her feet and rebuild her into a new Japan, hopefully unshackled by the legacy of the Pacific War. But with tensions brewing between West and East, just what would that new Japan look like? I'm Indy Neidell. This is a World War II Epilogue special about the occupation of Japan. Japan is a massive question mark in the Western Pacific. Defeated, sure. But what now? What shape should the occupation take? Should it be partition, the same as Germany? And what nation should be involved in such a project? And what of the emperor? The wording of the Potsdam Declaration in August was vague about his fate. Well, where the Potsdam Declaration lacks answers, the U.S. gives them. As the main force fighting the Japanese, the U.S. has significantly more say in the future of Japan than they did with Germany. In fact, American planning for this situation began almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. The lessons post-1918 were on the minds of American political and military leadership. And this time around, although the U.S. might have been unready for 1941, it is very much ready for 1945 and 1946. What the U.S. seeks in Japan is nothing less than total political and social change. And sort of like Joseph Stalin's Soviet occupation of Eastern European states, they mean to occupy the country under temporary military rule and gradually shift the population to a friendly ideology, in this case, a liberal democratic one. The idea is that after a suitable period of guidance, the U.S. will slowly withdraw its occupation forces and hand more control back to the civilian government, which does still exist during the occupation, by the way, though subject to Douglas MacArthur, whom the U.S. has placed in charge. The Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers Instructions, shortened to SCAPINS, is essentially a man with power of decree. MacArthur is bound by a set of general directives issued him by the U.S. government, but is given almost unrestricted powers to go about them. In essence, provided he delivers the results the U.S. is looking for, he's free to play dictator all he wants, a role which he doesn't not enjoy. Back on August 8th, Radio Tokyo announced in their report of the Hiroshima bombing that the American methods had surpassed in hideous cruelty those of Genghis Khan. Perhaps that's fitting, since the day American troops are supposed to arrive, August 26th, a typhoon intervenes and delays the operation for 2 days. But unlike the typhoon that wrecked the Mongol fleet in 1281, there is no divine wind strong enough to save Japan this time. At 9 a.m. August 28th, the Americans begin to arrive at Atsugi Airfield just southwest of Tokyo. The first to arrive is a forward communications group led by Colonel Charles Tench, consisting of 150 communications technicians, backed up by 38 combat troops for security. They secure the airfield the same day, and at 6 a.m. on August 30th, combat troops from the 11th Airborne Division begin pouring in. A plane full lands at the airfield every 3 or 4 minutes. One soldier will remark years later, they barely had time to get off the plane before the pilot was forced to turn to leave to avoid being hit by the next plane. By that evening, some 4,200 troops have descended on Atsugi and made the short trip east to Yokohama, where U.S. 8th Army sets up its headquarters in an abandoned customs house. MacArthur himself also arrives this day, flying in around 2 p.m. on his C-54 transport plane Bataan. During the trip, he passes on Washington's initial policy instructions to Colonel Courtney Whitney. First, destroy the military power, punish war criminals, build the structure of representative government, modernize the Constitution, hold free elections, enfranchise the women, release the political prisoners, liberate the farmers, encourage a free economy, abolish police oppression, develop a free and responsible press, liberalize education, decentralize political power, separate the church from the state. The first days of the occupation are fraught with tension. After all, the Japanese showed almost inhuman determination and tenacity in defending places like Okinawa and Iwo Jima, so strong anti-American resistance is expected, peace agreement or not. And just what does await them in Japan? In truth, not much. Sporadic acts of violence are occasionally directed at the occupying troops, but no real organized resistance pops up. Soldiers obediently, though reluctantly, disarm as ordered for the most part. For civilians, the reaction is typically even more muted. The Japanese propaganda machine shattered. Their initial reaction is one of confusion and bewilderment that Japan lost, followed by acceptance. The civilian population at large tends to show no hatred towards their occupiers and instead blames Hideki Tojo and the military government for bringing Japan to this point. The occupation, by extension, is regarded as merely a natural consequence of Tojo's folly. In truth, most civilians are too busy trying to feed themselves to pay much mind to the events unfolding before them. Because things are really bad right now in Japan for the locals. Japanese industrial output stands at around 10% of pre-war levels. Yep, just 10%. Over the space of a few months, the Japanese urban wealthy, so long at the top of the social hierarchy, feel their entire world shaken, and the people they once regarded as beneath them now circle them like vultures. The entire supply chain has more or less collapsed. Bad weather in September also renders the 1945 harvest the worst since 1910. So now, if those urbanites want food beyond the meager rations supplied to them by the state, they need to make the trip out to farms and barter for it, or get it on the black market. Here's the thing though, although the black market has boomed in response to goods shortages and has become an incredibly profitable enterprise, much of it is controlled by Koreans and Formosans living in Japan who are used to having to resort to such methods to survive. Those former Japanese subjects are still celebrating the defeat of Japan and are very quick to capitalize on shortages by charging Japanese buyers extortionate prices. The Japanese farmers, too, have little love for the urban Japanese and drive unbelievably hard bargains for their food. Priceless family heirlooms and fine clothes are traded for a couple handfuls of rice. Famine threatens the nation, and 10 million Japanese hover just above starvation. MacArthur does his best to relieve the food shortages, ordering a shipment of army wheat to be delivered from Manila. This does not reach Japan until January 1946, though, and by around May, they're back in the same situation as before. Feeding a country as densely populated as Japan is no easy feat. MacArthur pleads Japan's case to Washington and stresses the need for regular food deliveries from the Allies if his mission is to succeed. But those regular deliveries won't start in earnest until September. In the meantime, British and American grain being held for the army in case of emergency is released to alleviate the symptoms. The urban elite, like politicians and prominent members in the zaibatsu groups, the financial and industrial conglomerates that used to run much of the economy, they, unsurprisingly, do eventually find a way to stay at the top of the food chain. Much of Japan's remaining military stocks, including rations and basically everything that is not nailed down, was gathered up by these people after the Japanese surrender. Goods earmarked for the reconstruction and entrusted to Japanese institutions by MacArthur also have a habit of disappearing and turning up in a zaibatsu-affiliated warehouse. Many prominent war criminals also managed to weasel their way back into politics and avoid punishment, despite MacArthur's instruction to punish them. Partly, this is because he comes to realize that the Allies need at least some experience and continuity in the Japanese political framework to keep things stable, especially with the ongoing Chinese Civil War threatening to further disrupt Asia. But what exactly do the occupation forces look like? Well, they are predominantly American, but maybe not quite so overwhelmingly American as you might think, and are intended to be even less so. See, back on August 18th, U.S. President Harry Truman consented to inviting Allied armies to contribute to the occupation. This would have been similar to the German zones of occupation, but with one key difference. It would be fully integrated into the U.S. command structure. Contributions from Britain, China, and the Soviet Union were envisioned. China's contribution was to be particularly important to avoid the appearance of conquering Westerners lording it over a subjugated Asian people. Unfortunately, Mao Zedong's communist China has other ideas, and before Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek can deploy a single soldier to Japan, the Chinese Civil War reignites. The Soviets consider the proposal, but insist on retaining command of their troops rather than handing it over to MacArthur. This is a concession the US is unwilling to make, so that's out. Stalin does, however, deport some 700,000 Japanese POWs from Manchuria to gulags and work camps to assist with rebuilding the USSR. Some eventually do return to Japan, and there they will face screening and questioning by U.S. counterintelligence wary of Soviet spies. But even by the mid-1950s, over half of those deportees will be unaccounted for and presumed dead. The British and the Commonwealth nations are happy to send troops for occupation. Not exactly the massive multinational effort that the U.S. was hoping for, but it is the best MacArthur's going to get. Britain had always intended to take part in the occupation of Japan since the planning of Operation Downfall, as both then Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Foreign Minister Anthony Eden considered this essential to preserving future British influence in Asia. The British Commonwealth Occupation Force arrives in Japan in February 1946, occupying Shikoku and the western tail of Honshu. This force is primarily British, Australian, and New Zealander. At its largest, it will actually constitute nearly a quarter of all Allied troops in Japan. The role and contribution of this force will be underestimated and misunderstood, though, even in the far future, and even in Japan itself, partially because of MacArthur's censorship policies early in the occupation. These censorship policies are at times just as draconian, if not even more so, than the Japanese propaganda machine they've replaced. Not only censoring anything MacArthur deems unpalatable, but also any mention of the idea of censorship. One thing that is just blanket censored is information on troop deployments or movements. So, unless you're in an area occupied by the Commonwealth forces, you'd be very unlikely to know they existed in the first place. But let's ask the big question. What about the Emperor? Of course, in U.S. pre-surrender planning, there was a lively debate about whether Hirohito should remain on the throne, whether he should be punitively deposed, or even whether the monarchy itself should be dissolved, which I talked about in the regular episodes. Before the surrender, one American who took it upon himself to champion Hirohito's survival is Undersecretary of State Joseph Grew. He looked into this issue in great detail throughout 1944 and early 1945, and believes that the emperor's fate was, in his own words, the greatest obstacle to unconditional surrender by the Japanese. Grew points to interrogation reports by the Office of Naval Intelligence's Psychological Warfare Section, which concur with his analysis. John Emerson of the State Department will later recall, "It was difficult to persuade these shamed and sickened veterans even to think about losing the war, a consequence for the homeland no loyal subject of the emperor would at first contemplate. But should the emperor, in his divine wisdom, order them to lay down their arms, they would of course do so. It was that simple." Grew argues his case to both Truman and Secretary of War Henry Stimson, eventually warming both of them to the idea. The U.S. soon also found international support for this policy, finding that the British at Potsdam already had similar views about Emperor Hirohito's future. Moreover, Hirohito finds another supporter in MacArthur himself. MacArthur believes Hirohito should remain on the throne, and that the survival of the monarchy is just as vital to the success of the occupation as it was to the surrender in the first place. Through a series of meetings and photo opportunities between MacArthur and Hirohito, the emperor becomes increasingly a symbol of the new Japan as well as the old, working with the Allies to bring about a liberalized future for the nation. In many ways, Hirohito is the linchpin that connects the Japanese civilian government to the Allied military administration and binds the occupation together. On New Year's Day 1946, Hirohito addresses his people and formally renounces his divine status, declaring his humanity. This is considered a big step in the transition to a liberal democracy, abandoning the claim of divine right to rule. The declaration has been carefully formulated by various contributors, including Prime Minister Kizuro Shidehara, Foreign Minister Yoshida Shigeru, the British scholar Dr. Reginald Blythe, who at this time was English tutor to the Crown Prince Akihito, and by Hirohito himself. The final version is read and approved by MacArthur. The message is clear. Hirohito shall remain on the throne, but will not stand in the way of the Allies' vision of Japan's future. But Japan has already taken its first steps towards that vision even before the New Year's address. On October 11th, 1945, new Prime Minister Shidehara pays his first visit to MacArthur, 2 days after establishing his new government. Shidehara's cabinet contains a number of ministers who'd once been jailed for their opposition to the war. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're liberal or anti-monarchy. In fact, most of these dissidents are conservative monarchists whose sole crime was opposing war with the Allies. However, the new government quickly finds MacArthur is interested in more than just a regime friendly to the West. MacArthur tells Shidehara to modernize the Meiji Constitution effective immediately, handing him a list of 5 key reforms to be instituted. In order, these are: the enfranchisement of women, the acceptance of labor unions and outlawing of child labor, reformation of the education system, elimination of the secret police, and finally, promotion of a wide distribution of income and ownership of the means of production and trade. These reforms, which are to be executed immediately, represent nothing less than an overnight change to the political and social fabric of Japan. The instructions, although extreme by conservative Japanese standards, are carried out, and by early 1946, the first wave of liberal reforms sweeps across the nation. However, there is still a lot to do, and the American project in Japan is just beginning. There are more reforms to be executed, more milestones of liberty to be realized, and most importantly of all, more people to be fed. But it is a start. And as time goes on, MacArthur will continue to inspire and enlist the help of reformists in Japan, eventually handing more and more control over to the democratically elected civilian government, and restraining himself in his use of interventions and vetoes. Japan has a long way to go to overcome their hardships and assume their place at the forefront of the battle for liberal democracy in Asia, with many speed bumps and hypocrisies along the way. But as they've proven to the Allies so many times over the course of this long and bloody war, the Japanese are nothing if not a resilient and resourceful people. My coverage of that long and bloody war was made possible by the TimeGhost Army. And there are other wars to cover, such as Korea, which I'm currently doing. So that I can continue to bring you this coverage, join the TimeGhost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com and be part of all of this. Here is a Between Two Wars episode about Japanese militarism in the 1930s, so you can see how a lot of where we are now got started. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.